Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. When it comes to the law in Vermont, our Supreme Court has the final say. The court's 5 justices are the ultimate arbiters of appeals arising from any legal case in Vermont. Despite its importance, the judiciary is the least understood branch of our system of government. So to learn more about the judiciary and how it works, we're joined by one of the longest-serving justices in state history. The Honorable John Dooley was appointed to the top court in 1987. He served 30 years, which means he's been involved in the most significant issues of our generation. It's very wonderful and an honor to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So yesterday we talked about your background a bit and your appointment to the court, and today I'd like to speak a little bit more about the workings of the court and some of your cases. So first of all, help us understand, how is the Vermont Supreme Court different from the United States Supreme Court?
Well, in this country, most law is actually state law, and most of the cases are state cases. In fact, 95% of all court cases in the country are in state courts, not in federal courts, of which the federal court system, the top of it, is the United States Supreme Court.
Right.
So we're in the, you might say, more the people's court. That is like in family kind of proceedings. You're not going to see those in the United States Supreme Court,
right,
or over there in the federal system, particularly at all. And the biggest difference in what appears to be the way is the Vermont Supreme Court has to take every appeal.
Every single case you have to take it.
Every single case we have to take it, whereas the United States Supreme Court gets to pick and chooses only a very, very few cases to address in a year, most of which are constitutional decisions.
Well, and most people think that the U.S. Constitution is the law of the land. So is the Vermont Constitution subservient to that, or how does that balance out?
No, we are a nation of states. The states and their state constitutions are the first, and I would argue primary constitutions in the country. And then along came the federal constitution on top of it. So you, I, every citizen has constitutional rights under the state constitution with respect to actions by the state, and under the federal constitution with respect to actions in the federal government, and also some actions by state government. They're complementary, not at war with each other.
Okay, great. So when lawyers appear before the Supreme Court, they make oral arguments, and they have to respond to your questions, of course. How important is that oral presentation for lawyers making their cases?
That oral presentation is very important. It's the chance for the lawyers to take these nice, maybe somewhat dry legal principles and turn them into a personal kind of approach and a personal argument about why it's fair or just for their client to win. And it's been part of the presentation to appellate courts from the very, very beginning. It's the written part that's grown probably more in importance because partially technology, this stuff is available, and there's more things you can find for purposes of it. And now courts, everybody, when you see an argument, they have read carefully the written arguments.
So you could have a poor oral argument, and it's your written that's really
It's probably the more important of the two, right? But they're complementary, and they're not. It's a different kind of approach to the case.
Sure.
Remember, that is, the judges are trying to get the right answer. It's not a question of who did the best argument.
Sure.
We have kind of moot courts for those, and you see those maybe on television or whatever. The question is, what's the right answer?
Right.
And so it doesn't mean that the person with the best argument skills is going to win. The person who has the best case, you hope, is going to win.
Okay, so in that video clip, we see you coming in, and then justices leave the courtroom, of course. Where do you go to discuss those cases, and what goes on behind closed doors?
Well, the first thing we do is go to an adjoining room where we would have a conference on the cases. And every appellate court in the country and the United States Supreme Court does essentially the same thing. So while the argument is fresh in the mind of the justices, we go around the table and each gives their views as of that time as to what the outcome ought to be. In Vermont, each case is assigned arbitrarily. That is, automatically, every fifth case goes to somebody to do the writing. If it turns out they're in the minority, it may be somebody else will do that one. There may be a trade or whatever, but that's generally what the system is as to who writes. But it gets everybody talking about the case and getting preliminary views. Now, when you start to getting to the challenge of writing all of that, you may say, oh, those preliminary views, maybe I've got some different thoughts about them now. So they are preliminary.
You've heard your other justices might have a different opinion.
You've heard that, and there's been some conversation about that, and that may change it over time. But actually, for most of the cases, the preliminary discussion of it will turn out to be the final result.
Okay. Well, for you, is there a particular type of case that is most difficult? I mean, criminal, civil, family, these are all very tricky things. Is there a type that was the most difficult for you?
Well, it depends on how you're using the term difficult. I think the ones that certain kinds of cases end up in what I'll just call generally heart and head problems. That is, your heart is with this, your head is with that, and the question is, how can you reconcile that, and how can you do that? And I think they're generally the most difficult kind of cases for you personally as a judge, and they tend to be because of that in family-related kind of matters.
Sure. Well, and in your opinion, what were some of the key cases that came before you? Of course, civil unions, education funding, but these are cultural changes. But you've also said that sometimes it's not those big cases that were most interesting to you.
No, in fact, I say to people about them, the more notorious, that is, publicly known a case it's probably the less interesting legally. That's just a general sort of observation that applies to some or not to others. Certainly the constitutional cases are very challenging. I don't know the citizens of Vermont understand that our Constitution is a Constitution largely done in 1777 and not changed. The least changed, it's by the way the shortest state constitution and the least changed in the country over its time. And so it's a very old document, and trying to apply very important principles and very important law to modern circumstances is very challenging.
Right. But you still have chosen not to make many changes. It's so interesting.
Oh, we don't do that.
Yeah, right, of course. That would be the legislature.
That would be, yes, but by popular vote after the legislature recommends.
And that. So for several decades, I just want to get to this because it's so interesting. The Supreme Court has actually traveled away from Montpelier, outside of Montpelier on occasion, to hear cases, real cases, in different settings. I think we have some footage of Vermont High School. There's going to be one in Middlebury soon. Why do you move the court around?
Well, it's from the observation you made earlier, is we're probably the least known branch of the government. Some parts of the work we do is not transparent at all. Once you go in that room, for example, you talked about, and from then on in that case, the discussion and the writing is all not done publicly and is not observable until the final result comes out. So the court wants to make the rest of it as transparent, the input side, and particularly the interactions directly that occur in an argument. So it's been going on the road. First, it went to Vermont Law School, and that's happened now for many, many, many years, essentially, throughout my time on the Supreme Court. And now, and this mostly happened after I retired, actually, it's been going to other locations that, and particularly interest in a high school setting, because you're talking about trying to talk about the court to high school students, a younger audience than normally might get into and know about the court. And that's been done for that. And now this is the first trip to a college or university in the state.
To Middlebury. It's fabulous. So as you reflect on these 30 years as a Vermont court justice, What has changed? The law, lawyers, I mean, one, how do you get through all the cases that come before you?
I think a good way to look at this is and to look at society generally is the one thing you know is certain is change itself. That is, change is part of our life, and at a faster and larger pace. It seems like every year than the year before, and back through, and that's occurred. That is very much occurred in the legal system. One of the impacts is the modern technologies. You now get so much more information that's available to you just on the internet, and data sources for decisions from courts from the lowest to the highest all over the country. So you get a tremendous amount more information now than you did before. And that information is important in coming to accurate decisions.
Sure. So it's doing that. So just because you have the rocket docket, in other words, you're able to move through cases, some cases very quickly, also seems pretty profound. But it's this information that you have more readily accessible that you feel has changed things.
Lots more information. And the rocket docket has been a great tool of modernizing the Supreme Court. It used to be every case got the same amount of time, and then you realize, well, wait a minute, some cases, like the ones constitutional cases you were talking about, are so much more difficult, larger, lead a lot more time than some cases that are very settled law, just applying new facts that don't need that time.
So we're really out of time, but on a closing note, one thing you want the public to understand about the Vermont Supreme Court.
The Vermont Supreme Court is their body. It is a body that represents the people of the state of Vermont and the most important legal issues that arise in the state. And the Vermont public, we would hope, would learn more about it, and they should offer their views on it. If they think we're not going in the right direction, they should say so loud and clear.
I love it. Thank you so much, Justice John Dooley, for spending some time with us today and helping explain the law. And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard.